The first thing I remember after the surgery wasn't pain, it was a voice, low, calm, right at my ear in the dark, saying, "Don't fight it, Harold. Just let it happen." I opened my eyes to an empty room, machines humming, a red light blinking somewhere near the door. Nobody there. Nobody there every single time I woke up gasping at 3 in the morning for 11 straight nights. And every single morning after, something in that room was different. A pen missing from my nightstand, my wedding ring turned the wrong way on my finger, my reading glasses folded shut when I always left them open. I told the nurses, I told my son. And 2 weeks later, in a courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old paper, I watched my own boy stand up in a gray suit I'd paid for and tell a judge that his father, 63 years old, sharp enough to run a company for 38 years, had lost his mind. I didn't know it yet. Sitting there in a wheelchair with a healing hip and a heart that felt like it had been run through a wood chipper, but somewhere in a server room 3 floors below that hospital bed, a camera had been recording every single one of those 3 a.m. visits. And it hadn't caught a ghost, it had caught my son's face. Welcome back to Dad's sweet revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, every villain in these stories thought they were the smartest person in the room. They were not. Subscribe so you never miss a story. My name is Harold Whitmore. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house outside Denver with 4 brothers and a father who worked concrete for 30 years before his back gave out. I never went to college. I went to work. I swept floors at a roofing supply warehouse when I was 19 years old, and by the time I was 26, I knew more about shingle grades and flashing tolerances than the man who owned the place. I started Whitmore Building Solutions in 1988 with a single flatbed truck and $11,000 I'd saved working double shifts. 38 years later, it supplied roofing and siding materials to contractors across 4 states, employed 110 people, and had a warehouse floor I still walked every single morning before the sun came up, because that's the kind of man I am. I don't sit behind a desk and pretend the work happened without me watching it happen. My wife, Eleanor, passed 6 years ago. Cancer, slow and cruel the way it always is, and I nursed her through every single day of it myself, because that's what you do for the person you promised your whole life to. After she was gone, it was just me and the company and 2 grown children who'd built lives of their own. My daughter, Claire, was a pediatric nurse in Portland, married, 2 kids, a woman who called me every Sunday like clockwork whether she had news or not, just to hear my voice. And my son, Derek. Derek was 37 years old, and Derek was the reason I was lying in that hospital bed, listening to a voice in the dark tell me to stop fighting. I need to back up, though, because you need to understand who Derek was before all this. And you need to understand what happened the night I ended up in that hospital in the first place, because nothing about that fall was an accident. I just didn't know it yet. Derek had worked at Whitmore Building Solutions for 12 years, most of them in operations, a few of them, more recently, trying and failing to convince me it was time to sell. Not sell my share to him, mind you. Sell the whole company outright to an investment group that had been circling us for 2 years. Ever since we landed a supply contract with a regional home builder chain that tripled our annual volume overnight. The man running that investment group was named Preston Kane, and I'd met him exactly once, at an industry mixer downtown where he'd shaken my hand a half-second too long and told me my company was, in his exact words, sitting on more value than you know what to do with, Harold. I'd smiled, thanked him for his time, and never called him back. Derek had called him plenty. I just didn't know that yet either. "You're 63, Dad." Derek had said to me over dinner about 4 months before all this started, cutting into a steak he hadn't earned the money for. "You've built something incredible, but you're not going to run this thing forever. Kane's offer is real money, generational money. You could retire, travel, actually live a little instead of walking that warehouse floor at 5 in the morning like you're still 26. I like the warehouse floor, I'd told him, which was true, and which was also, I understand now, exactly the kind of answer a man gives right before someone decides to stop asking him nicely. "I just don't want you working yourself into the ground," Derek said. And I believed him, because he was my son, And because a father spends a lifetime training himself to hear love in his children's voices, even when something else has started growing underneath it, the night of my fall was an ordinary Tuesday. Derek had come by the house, my house, the one Eleanor and I bought in 1994 and where I still lived alone, to help me replace a light fixture in the upstairs hallway, or so he said. He left around 9. I went to bed around 10:30, and at 11:40, I got up to use the bathroom, and the top stair, the one I'd walked 1,000 times, gave way under my foot like the wood itself had turned to water. I don't remember the fall itself, not really. I remember the sound my hip made, which I will not describe to you, because some sounds don't belong in anyone's memory but the person who heard them. I remember lying at the bottom of the stairs for 40 minutes before I could reach my phone. I remember the paramedics, the ceiling of the ambulance, the particular shade of fluorescent light they use in emergency rooms that makes everyone look like they're already halfway to being a ghost. What I did not know, lying in that hospital bed with a titanium rod now holding my hip together, was that the top stair in my house had been loosened, not broken, loosened. The screws backed out just enough to hold under normal weight and give way under a shift of balance, sometime in the 4 hours between when Derek left my house and when I went up to bed. I did not know that yet. I wouldn't know it for weeks. All I knew, in that first hazy stretch of recovery, was that something felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. The way you know a storm is coming, before a single cloud shows up on the horizon. The visits started on the third night. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing that saved me. I was on a moderate dose of pain medication, enough to make me groggy, but not enough, according to every doctor I would eventually speak to explain hallucination at exactly, and I mean exactly, 3 in the morning. I know this because I started keeping a small notepad by my bed the second night and forcing myself to check the wall clock the instant I woke. I would surface from a heavy, drugged sleep to the sensation of someone standing over me, not a dream, a presence, a weight in the air of the room that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. The first night I thought I imagined it. A shape near the IV pole, gone by the time my eyes adjusted. The second night, a voice, so quiet I almost convinced myself it was the hum of the ventilation system playing tricks on a sedated brain. Sleep, Harold. Just sleep. The third night, the voice was clearer, and it said something that has stayed lodged behind my ribs ever since. This is easier if you don't fight it. I pressed the call button. A nurse came in 11 minutes later. I know because I'm the kind of man who watches clocks, and found nothing. No one in the hallway camera footage near my door. She told me, though I would later learn that particular claim wasn't quite true. Or rather, it was true, only because nobody had thought to check the footage from the newly installed corridor system that had gone live just 2 weeks earlier. A system nobody on the overnight staff even fully understood how to pull archives from yet. You're probably still adjusting to the anesthesia, the nurse said kindly, patting my hand like I was a confused old man, which, I want to be clear, made something cold and quiet settle into my chest, because I had run a company through 2 recessions, negotiated freight contracts with men who'd sooner cut your throat than your delivery price, and buried my wife without falling apart in front of my children. I was not a confused old man. I knew the difference between a dream and a hand moving across my nightstand. Because that's the other thing. Every single morning after one of those visits, something in my room had changed. The third morning, my reading glasses, which I always leave open on the nightstand, folded shut. The fifth morning, the framed photo of Eleanor that Claire had brought from home turned to face the wall instead of my bed. The seventh morning, my wedding ring, which I'd kept on even in the hospital, because some things you don't take off, not even for surgery, turned around backward on my finger, the band facing out instead of in, exactly the way it would be if someone had removed it while I was unconscious, and put it back on in a hurry, guessing wrong about which way it went. I told Derek about the ring on his next visit. I watched his face very carefully when I did, the way I used to watch a supplier's face when I asked a question I already suspected I knew the answer to. "Dad," he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, something rehearsed. "You were pretty out of it after surgery." Sometimes patients turn things themselves without remembering. It's really common, actually. I looked it up. You looked it up, I repeated, after you mentioned the glasses. Yeah. Post-anesthesia confusion is more common than people think, especially at our age. I mean, at your age. He caught the slip. I watched him catch it. And I said nothing. Because 15 years of sitting across negotiating tables had taught me that the moment a man realizes he's said too much is the moment he starts talking faster to cover it, and I wanted to hear exactly how fast Derek could talk. Anyway, he went on right on schedule. I talked to Dr. Reyes about it. He thinks it might be worth running some cognitive screening, just to be safe, just so we know what we're dealing with. I said that sounded reasonable. I said it in the same calm, easy voice I'd used to close a $40 million supply contract 2 years earlier, because I had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do to a man who is lying to you is let him see that you know. I didn't know Dr. Colton Reyes from anywhere other than the hospital badge on his coat. I would learn, in time, that he and Derek had been friends since college, and that friendship was about to become the single most expensive mistake either of them ever made. That night, the seventh night, I did something I hadn't done since the fall. I stayed awake on purpose. I turned my body toward the door, kept my eyes open behind mostly closed lids the way you learn to do in 100 late-night business dinners where you need to look asleep at the wheel without actually being asleep at the wheel. And I waited. At 2:58, the door opened without a sound. I want you to sit with that detail, because it mattered more than almost anything else that happened in this whole story. The door to my hospital room made a distinct sound every single time it opened, a soft mechanical hiss followed by a click, loud enough that I'd heard it from every nurse, every orderly, every visitor for 11 straight days. The door that opened at 2:58 on the seventh night made no sound at all. Someone had oiled the hinges. A shape moved into the room, backlit by the hallway light, tall, moving with a familiarity that told me this wasn't the first time this particular pair of feet had crossed this particular floor. I kept my breathing slow, even, the rhythm of a sleeping man, while every nerve in my body screamed at me to sit up and turn on the light. The figure moved to the IV stand. I heard the small plastic click of a port being accessed. I heard very quietly the voice again, right at my ear. Warm breath that I recognized in a way that made my stomach drop through the floor of that hospital and keep falling. "Almost there, old man," the voice said. "Just a little longer and this'll all be so much easier." I did not move. I did not open my eyes fully, but in the thin sliver of light through my lashes, in the half-second before the figure straightened and turned toward the door, I saw a wristwatch, a very specific wristwatch, gold-faced, black leather band, a small chip in the crystal at 2 o'clock from the summer he was 14, and dropped it off a dock at the lake house. I had bought that watch. I had given it to my son for his college graduation with my own 2 hands. I lay there until the door hissed and clicked shut again, and then I lay there for another hour after that, staring at the ceiling of a hospital room at 4 in the morning, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the exact moment a bridge you've stood on your whole life quietly, silently, begins to collapse under your feet. I didn't call for a nurse. I didn't press the button. I didn't do anything that night except lie very still and start, for the first time since the fall, actually thinking like the man who'd built a company out of a single flatbed truck instead of the frightened patient everyone in that hospital wanted me to believe I'd become. By morning, I had a plan. I just didn't have proof yet. And I didn't know it then, but I was about to find out that my son wasn't working alone, and that the person who was about to hand me the proof I needed was someone none of us saw coming at all. I called Frank Delgado at 6 the next morning, the earliest hour I could justify without waking a 70-year-old man who still kept cops' hours out of habit. Frank had spent 26 years with the Denver PD before he retired to do private security consulting, and he'd handled every alarm system and loss prevention contract Whitmore Building Solutions ever needed. More than that, Frank had known me since before Derek was born. He'd been a pallbearer at Eleanor's funeral. Say that again. Frank said, his voice gone flat and careful the way it does when he's already decided to believe you and is just working out how bad it is. My son was in my hospital room at 3 in the morning doing something to my IV line, I said. I saw his watch, Frank. I gave him that watch. You sure it was him and not a nurse checking your line? That's routine, Harold. They do that. Routine nurses don't oil hinges so the door doesn't wake the patient, I said. Routine nurses don't tell you it'll be easier if you stop fighting it. The line went quiet for a long moment. I'll be there in an hour, Frank said. Don't tell anybody else what you told me. Not the staff, not Derek, not the pretty doctor who keeps asking you what year it is. Nobody. I wasn't planning to. And Harold, start writing everything down. Times, dates, exactly what you remember. Your own memory's the best evidence you've got until we find something better. I already had 11 pages in that notepad by the time Frank walked through my door, and by the time he left that afternoon, we had a plan that started with something so simple it should have occurred to me the very first night. The hospital had cameras. Not in the rooms, that would have violated a dozen privacy statutes and I wouldn't have wanted it any other way, but in the hallways, at every nursing station, at every elevator bank, and critically, mounted directly above the door of every patient room on the 3rd floor, as part of a new fall prevention monitoring system the hospital had installed only weeks before I'd ever been admitted. That system logged, at minimum, every single time a door opened, whether or not it was equipped with full video. Getting access to that footage, though, was not going to be as simple as walking up to the nurse's station and asking nicely. Hospital security footage is protected, tightly controlled, released only through proper administrative and, in most cases, legal channels. Frank knew a man on the hospital's facilities board from his old security consulting days, a fellow named Gerald Pruitt, but even Gerald couldn't just hand over footage on a whim. What we needed was a reason, an official one, and what we needed even more than that was time, because if Derek suspected for 1 second that I was building a case, instead of slowly losing my grip on reality the way he needed everyone to believe, he would stop. He would simply stop, cover every track he'd made, and I would spend the rest of my life being the confused old man in every family conversation for the rest of forever, while he quietly finished whatever he and Preston Kane had started. So I did something that felt, in the moment, like swallowing glass. I played along. Dr. Reyes, I said the next morning, when the man came by on his rounds with a clipboard and a smile that had started to look, to my newly suspicious eye, like something rehearsed in a mirror. Derek mentioned some cognitive testing. I think that's probably wise, given everything I've been experiencing at night. I watched something shift behind his eyes. Relief, maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a plan clicking into its next gear. And I hated how easily I'd learned in 1 week to read the small tells of men who were lying to me. I think that's very wise, Harold, he said. We'll get you scheduled. What Reyes did not know, and what Derek did not know, was that I had spent the previous evening on the phone with my daughter, Claire, and I had told her everything. Not to loop her into some grand scheme just yet. I wasn't ready to ask that of her. But because a man doesn't survive discovering his son might be trying to destroy him without at least one person in the world who still looks at him like he's not losing his mind. Claire didn't say a word for almost 30 seconds after I finished talking. When she spoke again, her voice had the particular steel in it that I remembered from the year she'd fought a hospital administrator for 6 months to get a dying child the treatment he needed, back before she left bedside nursing for good. Dad, she said, I'm booking a flight. You don't need to do that. I have Frank Franks, a retired security guard, Dad, not a lawyer, and not your daughter. I'm coming. She landed 2 days later, walked straight from the airport to my hospital room, still wheeling her carry-on, and the first thing she did, before she even hugged me, was pull the small notepad out of my hand and start photographing every single page with her phone. In case anything happens to the original, she said, and I understood, in that moment, that my daughter had already jumped several steps ahead of where I was, already thinking not just about proving I was sane, but about protecting evidence from disappearing. It was Claire, 3 days into her visit, who got the first real break in the case, though it came from a source none of us had counted on. Derek's wife, Renee, had married my son 9 years earlier, a quiet, careful woman who worked as a paralegal downtown, and who had always struck me as sharper than she let on in family conversations, the kind of woman who watches more than she talks. Renee came by the hospital alone on a Thursday afternoon while Derek was, according to her, handling some paperwork at the house. My house, the one he now had a key to, ostensibly to keep an eye on it while I recovered. "Harold," she said, sitting down in the chair by my bed with a stiffness that told me, before she said a single other word, that something had come to a decision. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not tell Derek I told you." "Renee, what's going on?" "I was looking for the checkbook 2 nights ago. In his home office, the desk he keeps locked, but he'd left it open because he was in a hurry." She swallowed. "There was a folder, Harold. Guardianship petition paperwork, already drafted, already dated for filing, from before your fall, weeks before. There was a printout of the stairs in your upstairs hallway, with measurements written on it in his handwriting. And there was a name I didn't recognize, Preston Kane. Emails between them about something called an expedited liquidity event, contingent on resolution of ownership capacity issues. I sat very still in that hospital bed, feeling something that had been a suspicion for 11 days finally harden into something with edges and weight and a shape I could hold. "He was planning this before I ever fell," I said. "I think so," Renee said, and her voice cracked on the second word. "I think he might have. Harold, I don't want to believe what I'm thinking, but the measurements on those stairs—" "I know," I said, "because I did. Because some truths don't need finishing." Renee left me a photograph of the guardianship paperwork's filing date on her phone before she left that day, a date that fell 3 full weeks before my fall down those stairs, which meant that whatever was happening in my hospital room at 3 in the morning wasn't a spontaneous cruelty. It was phase 2 of a plan that had started the moment Derek decided his father's answer of, "I like the warehouse floor," wasn't going to change on its own. I called Diane Marsh that evening. Diane had been Whitmore Building Solutions outside counsel for 19 years, sharp as a table saw and twice as unforgiving when she needed to be, and she'd handled my personal estate planning for almost as long. When I told her what I suspected, elder financial abuse, forged intent behind a staged fall, possible tampering with my medical care to manufacture grounds for guardianship, she didn't gasp, didn't express shock, didn't do any of the things a lesser attorney might have done. She simply asked, "What do you have, and what do you need?" "I have my own memory, my daughter's photographs of my notes, and a folder my daughter-in-law isn't supposed to have shown me," I said. "I need the hospital's door access logs and camera footage from my room for the last 11 nights. And I need it obtained legally enough that nobody can throw it out of a courtroom." "That," Diane said, "I can get." Hospitals are required to preserve security footage under a formal preservation request, especially once there's a documented safety concern raised by the patient. I'll draft a letter tonight citing your reported nighttime disturbances as a patient safety matter. That'll force them to lock the footage down before anyone with access can quietly delete it. It was, I would later understand, the single most important phone call of the entire ordeal, because 48 hours after Diane's preservation letter landed on the hospital's legal desk, Gerald Pruitt, Frank's old contact on the facilities board, called Frank with something in his voice that told us everything before he said a word. "You're going to want to sit down for this," Gerald said. "The footage, once Diane's letter forced its release under proper legal channels, showed exactly what I already knew in my gut, but had never let myself say out loud in full. 7 separate nights across the 11 I'd been hospitalized. The door to my room opened at almost precisely 3 in the morning, always within a 4-minute window, always preceded by a visit. The camera caught this too, from a hospital orderly named Miles Foster to a supply closet down the hall, where he could be seen retrieving something small enough to fit in his palm before making his way to my door and letting a second figure in behind him. A figure who came and went, without ever once appearing on the main corridor camera, because he was using the stairwell exit at the far end of the floor, the one whose camera, we would later discover, had been reported as malfunctioning and left unrepaired for exactly the 11 days of my hospital stay. That last detail told Frank everything he needed to know about how deep this went. Somebody paid to have a camera taken offline, Harold, he said, staring at his laptop screen in the small conference room Diane had arranged for us at her office. That's not something Derek does with a phone call and a smile. That's somebody with real money greasing real wheels. Preston Kane, I said. Preston Kane, Frank agreed. The stairwell camera, malfunctioning as it was, hadn't been the only one in that hospital, though, a fact that whoever had bribed their way into disabling it either didn't know or hadn't thought all the way through. A secondary system, installed as a backup specifically for the fall prevention monitoring program, ran on an entirely separate network with its own independent recorder, tucked into a server closet 2 floors below, a system so new that most of the hospital's own facilities staff didn't fully understand its redundancy yet. Gerald Pruitt understood it. Gerald Pruitt had helped install it. That backup system had one camera angled to catch the stairwell door from the inside, a detail nobody outside of facilities even knew existed. And on that footage, time-stamped, unedited, impossible to argue with in any courtroom in the country, was my son's face, not a shape, not a shadow. Derek Whitmore, in scrubs he had no business wearing, letting himself out of that stairwell at 3:11 in the morning on the 7th night of my hospital stay, the exact night I had lain awake and heard his voice at my ear, and seen the watch I'd given him with my own 2 hands. I sat in that small conference room and watched my son's face on a laptop screen, and something in me that had been holding on by pure will finally let go, quietly, without a sound, the way a rope frays through all night before it finally snaps in the morning light. Diane reached over and put her hand on my arm. Frank said nothing at all, which from Frank was its own kind of kindness. There's more. Gerald had told Frank on the phone, and there was. Foster, the orderly, had a second job listed on his employment file, one the hospital's HR department hadn't cross-checked against conflict of interest policy because nobody had ever had a reason to look. A part-time consulting contract with a company called Meridian Wellness Advisory, LLC, whose sole listed officer, once Diane ran the corporate filings the next morning, turned out to be a shell entity controlled entirely by Preston Kane's investment fund. They had paid an orderly to help disable a hospital patient's judgment. Small, precisely calibrated doses, Diane would later confirm through an independent toxicology review of my charts, of a sedative combination that wouldn't show up as suspicious on a routine blood panel, but would reliably produce exactly the kind of nighttime confusion, disorientation, and difficulty distinguishing memory from dream that a guardianship petition would need to make its case in front of a judge who'd never met me before that hearing and had no reason to doubt a grieving, worried son. He wasn't just trying to scare you into compliance, Diane said quietly, closing her laptop that night in her office, the 2 of us the only ones left in the building. Harold, he was building a medical record. Cognitive decline, documented by an actual physician, corroborated by nursing notes, timed perfectly to a guardianship hearing that would hand him full financial control before you ever had a chance to explain yourself to a judge who'd already read a chart calling you confused. Once that control was in place, selling the company to Kane wouldn't have needed your signature at all. It would have needed his. I sat with that for a long moment, the full architecture of it. 38 years of my life reduced in my son's mind to an asset that simply needed the right paperwork attached to the right diagnosis. How long do we have before the guardianship hearing? I asked. 9 days, Diane said. Then we have 9 days to make sure that when Derek Whitmore walks into that courtroom to tell a judge his father has lost his mind, the last thing he sees before it all comes down around him is his own face on a hospital camera at 3 in the morning. I didn't know it yet. Sitting in that office with the weight of everything Diane had just laid out settling into my chest like wet concrete, but the hardest part of the next 9 days wasn't going to be gathering the evidence. Diane, Frank, and Gerald had that well in hand. The hardest part was going to be sitting across a dinner table from my own son 3 more times before that hearing, letting him believe, right up until the very last second, that he had won. Living those 9 days took more out of me than the fall itself ever had. Every dinner Derek brought to my hospital room, and he brought them nightly now, take out containers of the soup I liked. His voice gentle in exactly the register a man uses when he believes he's already won. I sat across from my own son and asked him about his week, about his kids, about anything at all, except the thing I now knew with absolute certainty he was doing to me in the dark. "You seem better today, Dad," he said on the 7th of those 9 nights, setting a container of chicken soup on my tray table with the careful tenderness of a devoted son, and I want you to understand something about how that felt. It felt like being handed a gift by the same hand that had loosened a stair tread under your feet. "I feel clearer," I told him, which was, in its own way, the truest thing I'd said to him in 2 weeks. "That's good. That's really good, Dad." He sat down, and for just a moment, one single unguarded moment, something flickered behind his eyes that looked almost like grief, like a man standing at the edge of something he half wished he could still turn back from. "I just want what's best for you. You know that, right? I know you believe that," I said, and let him hear whatever he wanted to hear in it, because I had learned, over 38 years of negotiating with men who wanted to take things that weren't theirs, that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man mid-scheme is let him see the trap before it closes. On the 5th of those 9 nights, Frank did something we hadn't planned on needing, but that turned out to matter more than almost anything else in this story. He'd stayed parked outside Derek's house 2 evenings running, at Diane's suggestion, on the theory that a man 3 days from unraveling doesn't stay calm forever, and on that second night, through a cracked window on an unseasonably warm evening, Frank's directional recorder caught 11 minutes of a phone call between Derek and Preston Kane that Diane would later describe, dryly, as the single most expensive phone call in the history of bad decisions. He's not going to remember any of this clearly enough to fight it in court. Derek's voice said on that recording, thin and strained in a way I'd never heard from my son before. A man talking himself into something he already half hated himself for. "Ray's has the chart ready. Foster's confirmed for the hearing if they need him. Once the judge signs off, the sale goes through in 30 days? 45. If the board moves fast," Kane's voice answered, smooth as poured concrete, utterly untroubled. "You'll have your father's shares liquidated and the proceeds structured before he's even out of physical therapy, Derek. Nobody's going to look twice at an elderly man with a documented cognitive decline losing a company he can't safely operate anymore. That's not a scandal. That's a Tuesday. He built that place from nothing," Derek said, and there it was, the one crack in 11 minutes of otherwise business-like cruelty, a crack Frank caught on tape and that I would listen to, later, more times than I probably should have, because some part of me needed to know my son had at least felt the weight of what he was doing, even if he'd done it anyway. "And you'll build something bigger with what it's worth," Kane said. And that was the end of whatever hesitation my son allowed himself, because 30 seconds later he was back to discussing filing timelines, like a man closing a warehouse lease, instead of a man closing the door on his own father's life's work. Diane filed for an emergency evidentiary hearing the day before the scheduled guardianship proceeding, citing newly discovered evidence of elder abuse and fraud, a filing designed specifically to force everything into the same courtroom, in front of the same judge, on the same day. Derek had been counting on delivering his tidy, uncontested narrative of a confused old man who needed protecting from himself. The morning of the hearing, I put on the same Navy suit I'd worn to close the Meridian home builder contract 2 years earlier, because if I was going to watch my son's carefully built lie collapse in front of a judge, I wanted to look like exactly what I was. A man who built something out of nothing and still had every intention of keeping it. Derek didn't know Diane's filing had expanded the scope of the hearing, not until he walked into that courtroom and saw Frank sitting in the gallery beside Claire, saw Gerald Pruitt in the row behind them with a hard drive and a sealed evidence bag resting on his knee, saw Renee sitting apart from him in a seat she'd chosen herself, her face pale and resolute. I watched something go very still behind his eyes when he saw his wife sitting 3 rows away from where he'd expected her to be. Dr. Reyes took the stand first, exactly as planned on Derek's side, testifying with rehearsed clinical confidence about documented episodes of nighttime confusion, disorientation regarding time and place, and what he called a pattern consistent with early-stage vascular dementia, though further testing would be needed for a formal diagnosis. The judge, a woman named Patricia Osei, who I would come to be deeply grateful for before that day was through, listened to every word of it without a flicker of expression. "Dr. Reyes," Diane said, rising for cross-examination with the unhurried calm of a woman who already knows exactly how this ends, "were you aware that a toxicology review of Mr. Whitmore's overnight blood panels, conducted by an independent lab at my request under a court-ordered subpoena 3 days ago, identified trace levels of a sedative combination not listed anywhere in his prescribed medication chart?" The color left Reyes's face in real time. That would need to be verified through proper channels. "It has been," Diane said, and placed the lab report on the evidence table. Twice. She called Gerald Pruitt next, who walked the court through the hospital's dual-camera fall prevention system in plain, patient language, explaining how one camera had been reported malfunctioning for the exact 11-day span of my hospitalization, and how a second, independent backup system, one the party responsible for disabling the first camera evidently hadn't known existed, had continued recording without interruption the entire time, and then Diane played the footage. I won't describe every second of it because I've watched it enough times myself, and I don't need to relive it in more detail than the courtroom already did that day. But I will tell you what mattered most: the timestamp, the stairwell door, and my son's face, clear as a photograph, at 3:11 in the morning on the 7th night of my hospital stay, still wearing the watch I'd given him with my own 2 hands. Judge Osei did not raise her voice. She simply looked at Derek, sitting rigid at the petitioner's table beside a lawyer who had gone very quiet, and said, "Mr. Whitmore, would you like to explain to this court why you're on hospital security footage entering your father's room through a disabled stairwell camera at 3 in the morning, 7 separate times, during the exact window your physician was documenting his so-called cognitive decline?" Derek didn't answer. He didn't need to. Diane played the recording of the phone call next, the one Frank had caught through a cracked window on an unseasonably warm evening, and I watched my son's own voice fill that courtroom, thin and strained, talking about liquidated shares and 45-day timelines, and a father who wouldn't remember any of it clearly enough to fight back. Preston Kane, seated in the second row as an interested party awaiting the outcome of a sale he'd expected to finalize within the month, stood up and walked out of that courtroom before the recording had even finished playing, which told everyone present everything they needed to know about how much loyalty men like that carry, once the money stops flowing in their direction. "This petition is denied," Judge Osei said, "and I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. Elder abuse, fraud, and tampering with a patient's medical care, at minimum. Mr. Whitmore's competency is not in question here. What is very much in question is the conduct of the people who tried to manufacture evidence to the contrary. Derek didn't look at me when they led the proceedings toward their conclusion. Couldn't, maybe. Wouldn't. I'll never know which. And I've stopped needing to know. I won't drag out the aftermath longer than it deserves, because the truth is, once that footage played, everything after it moved fast the way a house fire moves once it finds the gas line." Derek was charged, and eventually pled guilty to reduced counts in exchange for cooperation against Kane's fund and against Dr. Reyes, whose medical license was suspended pending a full board review. Miles Foster, the orderly, lost his job and his nursing certification and is, last I heard, working construction 2 states away under circumstances I have no interest in tracking further. Preston Kane's fund quietly withdrew from 3 other pending acquisitions. Once word got around the industry about what he'd been willing to bankroll, which is its own kind of justice. The quiet kind that doesn't need a courtroom. Renee filed for divorce the week after the hearing. She came to see me once, before she moved back to her sister's place in Boulder, and she cried in a way that told me she'd loved the version of my son that existed before all this. and mourned him the way you mourn someone who's still alive but gone all the same. I told her she'd done the right thing, coming to me with that folder, and she said something I've thought about often since. I just didn't want to be one more person in his life who looked away. I bought out the guardianship petition's legal costs from my own recovering estate without a second thought, and I rewrote my company's succession plan within the month. This time with Diane's help building protection so airtight that no single family member, no matter how convincing their intentions sounded at a dinner table, could ever again attempt what Derek attempted. Claire moved back to Denver 8 months later, not out of obligation, but because, as she told me over pot roast one Sunday, she'd learned Eleanor's recipe from an old family notebook and made it exactly the way her mother used to. She wanted to be close enough to actually watch the years happen, instead of hearing about them over the phone. I kept the watch, Derek's watch, the one with the small chip in the crystal, the one that told me everything I needed to know in a half-second of hospital darkness before I had a shred of real proof. It sits in a drawer in my home office now, and every once in a while, on a hard day, I take it out and hold it, not out of sentiment, but because it reminds me of something I never want to forget. The people who are trying to take something from you rarely announce it. They oil the hinges first. I still walk the warehouse floor every morning before the sun comes up. My hip aches sometimes when the weather turns, a permanent reminder of a stair tread that was never supposed to hold. But I am not, and never was, a confused old man. I am a man who built something out of nothing, who almost lost it to the person he loved most in this world, and who is still standing on that warehouse floor because he refused to let a lie about his own mind become the last word anyone ever spoke about him. My youngest grandson, Claire's boy, asked me once, not long after all of it settled, why Uncle Derek didn't come to family dinners anymore. I told him the truth, the plain version a 7-year-old could hold on to, that sometimes people who love you can still do something so wrong that loving them isn't enough to make it right again. He thought about that for a long moment. The particular serious way children think about things adults have long since stopped examining, and said, so the camera didn't lie, even when everybody wanted it to. I didn't have anything to add to that. He'd said it better than I ever could have.